March 1936. The Junkers factory floor in Dessau hums with precision, the rhythmic hammering of aluminum sheets, the hiss of welding torches, the chemical bite of sealant hanging in the cold air. Chief Engineer Klaus Zimmermann stands before a grainy photograph pinned to a design board, his colleagues gathered close in their pressed white shirts and thin ties. The image shows an ungainly machine, an American bomber called the Boeing 247, its stubby fuselage and fixed landing gear making it look more like a passenger transport than a weapon of war. Someone laughs, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoes off the factory's steel rafters. Die Amerikaner, one engineer mutters, shaking his head. They build furniture that flies. Zimmermann says nothing, but his silence carries agreement. In this moment, in this temple of German engineering excellence where the Ju-52 and Ju-87 Stuka take shape with mathematical perfection, the notion that America, that nation of jazz music and Hollywood frivolity, could challenge the Luftwaffe's technical supremacy seems not merely unlikely but absurd. Outside, spring snow melts into the Elbe River, and none of these men can imagine that within a decade, the skies above this very factory will darken with American bombers, their formations so vast they will blot out the sun. The dismissal was not born from ignorance but from a carefully constructed worldview, one rooted in genuine achievement and bitter memory. German aviation had dominated the previous war. Men like Manfred von Richthofen and Ernst Udet had become legends in Fokker triplanes and Albatros fighters that represented the cutting edge of aeronautical science. After Versailles, after the humiliation of forced disarmament, German engineers had rebuilt their industry in secret, studying, refining, perfecting. By the mid-1930s, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 was setting speed records, the Heinkel He-111 bomber combined elegance with functionality, and the entire Luftwaffe doctrine emphasized precision, tactical support, and the dive bomber's surgical strike capability. American aviation, by contrast, seemed rooted in commercial concerns, building airliners to cross vast continental distances, prioritizing passenger comfort and cargo capacity over military application. When German intelligence officers reviewed American aviation journals and patent applications, they saw a nation fixated on airmail routes and transcontinental passenger service. The Americans had no military aviation tradition to speak of, no Richthofen, no legacy of aerial combat excellence. Their industrial philosophy seemed backwards, mass production over craftsmanship, quantity over quality, democratic chaos over disciplined engineering hierarchy. This was the lens through which men like Zimmermann viewed American aviation, not with hatred, but with the bemused condescension of a master craftsman observing an enthusiastic amateur. But something was happening in Seattle that would shatter this certainty, though the transformation occurred so quietly that even American military planners initially failed to grasp its significance. In a Boeing factory hangar in 1934, a design team led by a soft-spoken engineer named Edward Curtis Wells was sketching something audacious, a four-engine heavy bomber that violated nearly every contemporary assumption about military aviation. It would be enormous, with a wingspan stretching 103 feet and a gross weight approaching 50,000 pounds when fully loaded. It would fly higher than existing fighters could intercept, cruising at altitudes above 25,000 feet where the air grew thin and hostile. It would carry not the 2,000-pound bomb loads typical of European medium bombers, but up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance across distances exceeding 2,000 miles. Most radical of all, it would bristle with defensive armament, .50 caliber machine guns positioned in power-operated turrets providing overlapping fields of fire, creating what Boeing engineers called a flying fortress. The name stuck. When reporters first saw the prototype, designated Model 299, sitting on Boeing Field in July 1935, its gleaming aluminum skin reflecting Puget Sound's gray light, one journalist from the Seattle Times looked at those 5 machine gun positions and wrote the phrase that would define it, Flying Fortress. The Army Air Corps, still thinking in terms of tactical support and coastal defense, had requested a twin-engine bomber. Boeing delivered something else entirely, a strategic vision made of aluminum and ambition. The prototype crashed during evaluation trials in October 1935, killing Boeing's chief test pilot and seemingly validating every European skeptic who questioned American technical competence. German aviation journals barely noted the incident beyond a brief mention. But the crash resulted from pilot error, failure to release a control lock, not design flaw, and the Army Air Corps, despite budget constraints and institutional resistance, recognized the revolutionary potential. A small initial order was placed. 13 Y-1 B-17s entered service in 1937 for operational testing. They were magnificent and troubled in equal measure, engines that overheated at high altitude, oxygen systems that failed, electrical problems that plagued long-range missions, turbo superchargers that required constant maintenance. Yet even in these early, flawed iterations, something unprecedented was taking shape. On practice missions across the American West, B-17s demonstrated the ability to locate and bomb naval vessels hundreds of miles offshore, flying above weather systems that would ground conventional aircraft, navigating through overcast skies using revolutionary new instruments, the Norden bombsight, radio direction finding equipment, and formation flying techniques that allowed multiple aircraft to mass their defensive firepower. American doctrine was evolving towards something no European Air Force had seriously contemplated: daylight strategic bombing, the ability to strike deep into enemy territory without fighter escort, to destroy industrial capacity and break the economic spine of modern warfare. June 1940. Wehrmacht soldiers marched through Paris, their boots striking cobblestones in perfect rhythm beneath the Arc de Triomphe. The campaign in France has been a symphony of German military excellence, panzers and Stukas working in devastating coordination, the Luftwaffe providing close air support that crushes enemy positions minutes before ground forces arrive. The war has been won, or so it seems, through speed and precision, through tactical brilliance and superior doctrine. In officers' clubs from Berlin to Brussels, Luftwaffe pilots drink cognac and discuss the British problem. England will fall by autumn, they assure each other, once the Luftwaffe sweeps the RAF from the skies. No one mentions America. Why would they? The United States is an ocean away, its army smaller than Belgium's, its air corps equipped with machines that seem quaint compared to the Bf-109E. German intelligence estimates suggest that even if America enters the war, a distant possibility that no one seriously contemplates, it would take years for their industrial base to shift from civilian to military production, years more to train pilots and crews to Luftwaffe standards. The Boeing bomber, now being produced in modest numbers and called the B-17C, is noted in reports as a defensive weapon, suitable perhaps for coastal patrol but lacking the range, the durability, the tactical doctrine to matter in modern warfare. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the nature of American industrial capacity, not merely its size, though that would prove staggering, but its philosophical foundation. German manufacturing excellence was built on skilled craftsmen, on tight tolerances and hand-fitted components, on the tradition of journeyman and master working in concert to create mechanical perfection. American manufacturing was built on something else: interchangeable parts, assembly line production. The radical notion that complex machines could be mass-produced by semi-skilled workers following standardized procedures. Henry Ford had proven the concept with automobiles. Now that same philosophy was being applied to four-engine heavy bombers. Boeing Seattle plant was being massively expanded. Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach began producing B-17s under license. A vast new factory rose from former farmland in Marietta, Georgia. The Bell Aircraft plant that would eventually employ 28,000 workers and produce B-17s at a rate that would have seemed impossible to any European manufacturer. The Americans were not trying to build perfect bombers. They were trying to build thousands of good enough bombers, and they were developing the industrial systems to do exactly that. By December 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor and Adolf Hitler made the fatal decision to declare war on the United States, the machinery of American aviation production was already accelerating toward levels that would redefine the possible. The first B-17s to reach Europe were not impressive. In the summer of 1942, the 8th Air Force began arriving in England, young American crews with minimal combat experience, flying B-17Es that were improved over earlier models but still vulnerable in ways their pilots didn't yet understand. The early missions were cautious, small formations striking targets in occupied France, learning the brutal realities of combat against experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots. German pilots assessed these early raids with professional interest. The American bombers flew in tight formations, their defensive guns creating overlapping fields of fire that made direct stern attacks costly. But they bled. Bf-109GS and FW-190s discovered that head-on attacks, coming at the bombers from 12 o'clock high where defensive armament was weakest, could break formations and send the great silver machine spinning down, streaming fire and trailing parachutes like dandelion seeds scattered by a violent wind. German fighter pilots began accumulating kills, adding American four-engine bombers to their victory tallies with the same professional satisfaction they felt for British Lancasters and Halifaxes. In officers' clubs in France and the Low Countries, the assessment remained consistent. The Americans were brave but inexperienced, their bombing inaccurate, their losses unsustainable. They would learn, perhaps, to emulate the British approach, night bombing, area attacks, abandoning the costly fiction that daylight precision bombing could succeed without fighter escort. This was the logical conclusion, the rational assessment based on available evidence. But the evidence was incomplete. The Luftwaffe was killing B-17s faster than seemed sustainable, but the Americans kept coming, and their formations were growing larger. August 17, 1943. The 8th Air Force launches its most ambitious mission yet, a double strike against Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories and Messerschmitt production facilities at Regensburg. 363 B-17s, the largest American formation yet assembled, drone eastward across Germany. The Luftwaffe responds with everything available, Bf-109s, FW-190s, even twin-engine destroyers like the Bf-110 equipped with heavy cannon and air-to-air rockets. The sky becomes a mathematics of violence. German fighters make repeated attacks, sometimes flying directly through American formations, their cannon shells ripping through aluminum skin, their pilots pressing attacks to point-blank range. B-17s fall, 60 bombers lost, 600 American airmen dead or captured in a single day. It is the bloodiest mission in 8th Air Force history. German propaganda celebrates a great victory, and by any reasonable measure, it is exactly that. Loss rates approaching 17% are unsustainable. No air force can endure such attrition. Yet something else happened that day, something visible in the gun camera footage and pilot reports filed by Luftwaffe aces who survived the battle. The American formations, despite horrific losses, maintained their integrity. Damaged bombers held position until physically unable to continue. When they finally fell behind, wingmen stayed with them, protecting cripples at the cost of their own safety. The bombs struck their targets. Ball-bearing production in Schweinfurt dropped by 38%. And even as funeral telegrams were being drafted for 600 families in Nebraska and Alabama and Oregon, new crews were already crossing the Atlantic to replace the dead. This was the thing German military planners had failed to account for, not American courage, which they respected, nor American industrial capacity, which they underestimated, but the combination of those factors with an ideology that permitted a level of acceptable loss unthinkable in the Wehrmacht's carefully husbanded fighter forces. The Luftwaffe couldn't replace its experienced pilots at anything approaching the rate they were being lost. Each veteran fighter pilot killed was a devastating blow to combat effectiveness. But American training pipelines were producing new bomber crews in numbers that seemed limitless. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force could lose 60 bombers in a single mission and launch an even larger raid 3 days later. The B-17s themselves were evolving through combat experience. The E model gave way to the F, then the definitive G variant with its chin turret eliminating the vulnerability to head-on attacks. Armor plate was added around vital crew positions. Self-sealing fuel tanks became standard. The Norden bombsight was refined until bombardiers could place bombs within 1,000 feet of their aim point from 25,000 feet. But the true transformation was occurring in how the bombers were employed. American commanders, absorbing the terrible lessons of 1943's Black Week in October, when combined losses approached 30% on missions to Schweinfurt and other deep targets, didn't retreat from daylight bombing. Instead, they waited for the right weapon. February 1944. Over Ostersleben, a Luftwaffe pilot named Heinz Nock, already an ace with 27 victories, spots an American bomber formation approaching through thin cirrus clouds. He begins his attack run, his FW-190's engine howling as he dives toward the B-17s from high altitude. Then he sees them, sleek, silver fighters with distinctive twin booms flanking their fuselages, flying alongside the bombers at 27,000 feet, an altitude and range that should be impossible for single-engine fighters. P-51 Mustangs, powered by British Merlin engines built in American factories, carrying enough fuel in internal and drop tanks to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Noak later wrote in his diary that this was the moment he knew Germany would lose the war. The mathematics of air combat had fundamentally shifted. Before the Mustangs, German fighters could attack bomber formations for extended periods, breaking off to refuel and rearm, then attacking again. Now they were being hunted by enemy fighters that matched or exceeded the performance of the Bf-109G and FW-190A, flown by pilots who were rapidly gaining experience and were supported by an industrial base that could replace losses within weeks. The Luftwaffe was being bled to death in its own skies, forced to defend against bomber streams that were growing larger, escorted by fighters that were growing more numerous, attacking with a relentless regularity that ground down pilot morale and aircraft reserves. The B-17s continued to fall. They were never invulnerable, never the invincible fortresses that early propaganda suggested. But for every bomber lost, American factories built 3 more. For every crew killed, the training pipeline produced 5 replacement crews. The Luftwaffe killed and killed and killed, and the bombers kept coming. The sound became a kind of psychological weapon itself, the deep, thrumming bass note of massed Wright Cyclone engines, hundreds of them in formation, creating a noise that could be felt in the chest before it was heard with ears. German civilians learned to recognize it, that distinctive drone that meant the Americans were coming in daylight, different from the higher-pitched note of British Lancasters that came by night. Children in Berlin and Hamburg and Cologne would hear that sound and know they had perhaps 20 minutes to reach shelters before the bombs began falling. The B-17 represented a peculiarly American approach to warfare, not the surgical precision of the Stuka's dive attack, not the massive area devastation of British night bombing, but something between. Formations of 50 or 100 or eventually 500 bombers, each aircraft precisely maintaining position, releasing their bombs on the lead bombardier's signal, creating a carpet of destruction that methodically erased railway yards, synthetic oil plants, aircraft factories, everything. That fed the Wehrmacht's war machine. The bombing was never as accurate as American claims suggested. Weather, flak, fighter attacks, and simple human error meant that many bombs fell on residential areas, killing tens of thousands of civilians. But the cumulative effect was undeniable. German war production, despite Albert Speer's frantic efforts to decentralize and protect key industries, began to collapse under the sustained assault. By mid-1944, fuel shortages grounded Luftwaffe fighters even when aircraft were available. Ball bearing production never recovered from the Schweinfurt raids. The transportation network that moved raw materials and finished goods disintegrated under repeated attack. And through it all, the B-17s kept coming, their formations growing larger, their losses becoming percentually smaller as Luftwaffe fighter strength was exhausted in fuel defense. In the waist gun position of a B-17G named Memphis Belle or Hell's Angels or any of 10,000 other bombers given names like Prayer and Talisman, a 20-year-old from Iowa or Mississippi or Brooklyn stands at his .50 caliber machine gun, watching German fighters make their attack runs through skies so cold that exposed skin freezes instantly. He wears sheepskin and leather and still shivers, breathes oxygen through a rubber mask, and knows that the aluminum skin protecting him is thinner than a dime. A single 20mm cannon shell can punch through the fuselage like paper, can sever control cables, can turn a flying machine into a burning coffin. He has seen bombers to his right and left simply disintegrate, direct hits on bomb bays turning aircraft into expanding fireballs. He has watched friends bail out over Germany, knowing they face either death in the air. Luftwaffe pilots sometimes shot at parachutes, though not as routinely as propaganda suggested, or years in prison camps. He is terrified, and he is 19 years old, and he will fly 25 missions like this before rotating home, if he survives, which statistically he has roughly a 60% chance of doing. But he stands at his gun because the men around him do, because his training has been thorough, because he believes, perhaps naively but genuinely, that destroying those factories below will end the war sooner and save lives in the aggregate. This is the human reality behind the statistics, behind the 1,000 bomber raids and the tonnage figures and the target assessment photographs. 10 men in a B-17, multiplied by thousands of aircraft, crossing hostile skies to drop bombs on people they will never see, suffering casualties that would have broken earlier generations but which are absorbed and replaced and returned to combat until the enemy's capacity to resist is simply destroyed. German engineers eventually studied captured B-17s with the same meticulous attention they once gave to dismissing them. At Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's test center, technicians examined every system, the turbo superchargers that enabled high-altitude performance, the Sperry ball turret that provided ventral defense, the oxygen systems that kept crews conscious at 30,000 feet, the rugged construction that allowed catastrophically damaged aircraft to return to base. They found a machine that was in many ways inferior to German design philosophy. The B-17's engines were less powerful than their Jumo or BMW equivalents, its aerodynamics less refined than a Ju-88's, its construction tolerances that would horrify a Junkers engineer. But they also found a machine designed for mass production and operational sustainability. Parts were standardized. Critical systems had redundancy. The airframe could absorb enormous battle damage and remain flyable. Where German bombers required skilled mechanics and specialized tools for maintenance, B-17s could be serviced by relatively inexperienced ground crews using standard equipment. One engineer, filing his assessment report, noted with something approaching admiration that the Americans had built not a perfect bomber but a bomber that could be manufactured by the thousands and maintained under field conditions by a conscript air force. They had solved an industrial problem that Germany, for all its engineering excellence, had never seriously addressed: how to wage industrial-scale air warfare with weapons designed for industrial-scale production. By the time this realization crystallized, it was far too late to matter. April 25, 1945. The last major B-17 raid of the European war targets Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, hitting the Skoda armament works. The bombers encounter no fighter opposition. The Luftwaffe, once the world's most formidable air force, has ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Some German jets still fly, Me-262s that are faster than any Allied fighter, technological marvels that represent the cutting edge of aviation science. But they are too few, too late, their fuel reserves exhausted, their pilots barely trained. Below, the Third Reich is collapsing into rubble and desperation. Soviet armies close on Berlin from the east. American and British forces advance from the west. The skies that once echoed with the thunder of air battles are now owned completely by Allied aircraft. B-17s return to bases in England without firing a single defensive round. That night, in what remains of German military intelligence, someone files a final assessment of American strategic bombing effectiveness. The report notes that German synthetic oil production has been reduced by 90%. Transportation networks are paralyzed. Aircraft production, once approaching 40,000 machines per year, has effectively ceased. The industrial capacity that enabled Germany to wage war across 3 continents has been systematically destroyed, and the primary instrument of that destruction was the machine that German engineers dismissed a decade earlier as unsophisticated American overconfidence made airborne. But the story of the B-17 is not simply a narrative of vindication and technological triumph. It is also a story written in the bodies of young men who burned to death at 25,000 feet, of German civilians crushed in collapsed air raid shelters, of moral compromises made in service of strategic necessity. Approximately 4,750 B-17s were lost in combat operations, and approximately 47,000 American airmen serving in 8th and 15th Air Forces were killed, a casualty rate that exceeded the Marine Corps. In Hamburg and Dresden and Berlin, strategic bombing killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and while the B-17 participated in far fewer civilian casualties than British night bombing, it was part of a campaign that blurred the distinction between military and civilian targets until entire cities became legitimate objectives. The men who flew these missions were not war criminals, they were young soldiers following orders, fighting an enemy whose own brutality was well documented. But neither were they the unblemished heroes of post-war mythology. They participated in a bombing campaign that killed approximately 350,000 German civilians and displaced millions more, and while this was arguably necessary to defeat Nazi Germany, necessary and righteous are not synonymous. The B-17 story is therefore a story of American industrial might and strategic vision, but also of moral complexity, of the terrible choices required when total war consumes industrial societies. The symbolic weight of the B-17 extends beyond its tactical and strategic impact. It represented a fundamental shift in how warfare would be waged in the industrial age, the application of mass production techniques to military aviation, the concept of acceptable loss rates in service of strategic objectives, the notion that industrial capacity could be as decisive as tactical brilliance. Nazi ideology emphasized the heroic individual, the ace pilot racking up victories, the panzer commander's tactical genius, the U-boat captain's solitary courage. American doctrine was more pragmatic and more terrifying: produce enough machines, train enough crews, develop robust enough logistics, and the outcome becomes mathematical. Individual heroism still mattered. Medal of Honor recipients in B-17 crews demonstrated extraordinary courage, but the system was designed to function even when heroes fell, to absorb losses that would cripple a force dependent on irreplaceable veterans. This approach, so alien to German military culture, proved devastatingly effective. In the final accounting, the Boeing engineers in Seattle who designed the B-17 created more than an aircraft. They created a weapon system that embodied American strategic thought and industrial philosophy, that married emerging technologies, turbo superchargers, precision bomb sights, defensive armament, high-altitude capability, with manufacturing processes that could produce complex machines in unprecedented numbers. The German engineers who dismissed it were not fools. They were products of a different industrial and military culture, one that valued precision over quantity, craftsmanship over mass production, tactical brilliance over strategic attrition. Their assessment was logical given their framework of understanding. What they failed to grasp was that American aviation was not attempting to compete within that framework but was creating an entirely different paradigm. The B-17 was never meant to be the world's best bomber in terms of speed, altitude, defensive armament, or bomb load, though at various points it led in several categories. It was meant to be a bomber that could be produced in vast numbers, maintained under field conditions, operated by crews with relatively brief training periods, and employed in formations large enough to saturate enemy defenses through sheer mass. In that objective, it succeeded completely. Today, a handful of B-17s still fly at air shows, their Wright Cyclone engines making the distinctive deep thrumming sound that once meant death falling from clear skies. Old men who flew in them, fewer each year, speak of the cold at altitude, the fear, the friends who didn't return, the strange guilt of survival. German veterans, those few who remained, speak with professional respect of the B-17's toughness, the discipline of American formations, the relentlessness of the campaign. Historians argue about strategic bombing's effectiveness, whether the resources devoted to it might have been better used elsewhere, whether the civilian casualties were militarily justified or constituted war crimes by more contemporary standards. These debates are important and unresolvable, each generation reframing the questions through their own moral lens. But the historical facts remain clear. The aircraft that German engineers dismissed as unsophisticated American overreach became one of the decisive weapons of the Second World War, destroying the industrial base that sustained Nazi Germany's military power and demonstrating that in industrial-age warfare, the capacity to produce adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers can triumph over the ability to produce perfect weapons in limited quantities. The sky over Dessau is quiet now, the Junkers factory long closed, its ruins cleared away and replaced by apartment blocks and shopping centers. No formations of silver bombers drone overhead. The men who dismissed American aviation are dead, as are most of the young Americans who proved them wrong. What remains is the lesson, recorded in tonnage dropped and factories destroyed and casualties suffered, that assumptions rooted in past success can blind even brilliant minds to emerging realities. That industrial capacity is itself a form of military power, and that in total war between industrial nations, the side that can sustain losses and continue fighting will defeat the side that cannot, regardless of initial tactical or technical superiority. The B-17 Flying Fortress was not invincible, not perfect, not the greatest bomber of the war by any single metric. But it was produced in numbers its designers initially thought impossible, 12,731 aircraft built between 1936 and 1945. And it carried the air war deep into Nazi Germany when German engineers were certain such a campaign was technically and operationally infeasible. That alone makes it worthy of remembrance, not as a symbol of American triumphalism but as a monument to the terrible effectiveness of industrial warfare and the young men who fought it, in the air and on the ground, until the guns finally fell silent and Europe began the long work of rebuilding from ruins.